Beading Strawberries, Beadwork as a Radical Act of Governance, Resistance, and Resurgence. Hello, my name is Sarah Zorzi. I'm an undergraduate student and a settler ally to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. I attend McMaster University and live as a guest on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit and Haudenosaunee nations, whose lands are protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Beadwork is not an art form. It is a record, a teaching, a responsibility. Like a wampum belt or a string of strawberries, each bead carries knowledge forward, linking the hands of the past beaders with those of the future. It is a practice of governance, of kinship, and of love. Before colonization, beadwork was embedded in law, diplomacy, and cultural continuity. Wampum belts recorded agreements between nations. Quillwork and beaded garments reflected stories of lineage and responsibility. Each stitch held meaning, binding individuals to their communities, to their obligations, to their histories. When the Indian Act, residential schools, and other colonial policies sought to sever traditions, beadwork did not disappear. It instead transformed into an act of defiance, declaration, and survivance. Like the young Ojibwe woman embarking on her strawberry fast, who abstains from the fruit as she learns to take on the responsibilities of womanhood, Indigenous women across generations have carried beadwork through times of silence, of absence, of longing. Like that young woman, when the time was right, they brought their knowledge back into the world, not just as resistance, but as resurgence. Before she can offer the strawberries to her community, the young woman must first gather them, learning from her grandmothers about the medicine they hold, about the responsibility that comes with them. Beadwork, too, has always been a site of governance, a space where law is woven through stories, colors, and patterns. Among the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Cree, wampum belts recorded legal agreements, their interpretation often resting with women. These belts were not merely symbols, they were archives of governance, their meanings carried forward in ceremony, their authority upheld through generations. Beadwork's governance was not limited to belts. Beading circles served as spaces of political teaching where stories of land, kinship, and law were passed from hand to hand. Traditional materials like quills, shells, stones, plant-based dyes, and hides of animals like moose and deer held within them knowledge of land, reinforcing a governance structure that was inseparable from ecological care. The beading circle, like the berry patch, was a place of gathering, of intergenerational learning. Elders and mothers guided young beaders not just in technique but in understanding, teaching them to see beadwork not as a decoration but as a political act, an assertion of presence and embodiment of responsibility. The young woman in her fast learns about absence. She listens to her grandmother's stories of what was lost and why. She understands that though the strawberries remain, their meaning was threatened, much like beadwork under colonialism. Before European interference, beadwork was an unquestioned part of governance and kinship, but under assimilation policies it became dangerous, something to be suppressed, hidden, and erased. The Indian Act stripped Indigenous women of their governance roles, replacing matrilineal leadership with Eurocentric, male-dominated structures. Residential schools severed knowledge transmission, criminalizing beadwork alongside with language and ceremony. At the same time, settler markets commodified and extracted indigenous beadwork, stripping it of its governance role. Women who once beaded for kinship and law were forced into economic precarity, selling their work for survival in a colonial economy that devalued their artistry. Yet, beadwork persisted. Women beaded in secret, encoding resistance into their designs. The beading circle became an underground site of radical governance, a space where political education continued beyond colonial surveillance. Each bead was stitched in defiance, each thread connecting back to what was nearly lost. When the young woman completes her fast, she gathers the strawberries she wants, but she does not take them for herself. She offers them to her community, understanding now that their sweetness is meant to be shared, that their nourishment is part of a larger responsibility. Beadwork follows the same teaching. It has never been just an individual craft. It is relational, intergenerational, deeply tied to community and governance. Indigenous women have long been the knowledge keepers of beadwork, using it to sustain relationships, pass on teachings, and hold the weight of their histories. Today, beading circles have reemerged as sites of cultural resurgence. Young people are returning to the practice, reclaiming not only the skill, but the governance and kinship systems embedded within it. Like the young woman offering her first berries, they are not beading for themselves alone. They are beading for the past and for the future, ensuring that knowledge continues to flow. Beyond resurgent, beadwork is a healing practice. The slow, intentional threading of each bead demands presence, patience, and reflection. For residential school survivors and their descendants, beading is a means of reclaiming fractured identities, stitching together what colonialism sought to break apart. This healing is communal, reinforcing relational accountability and cultural survival. As with the strawberries, beadwork faces challenges. Climate change disrupts access to traditional materials, threatening the ecological knowledge embedded in beading. Cultural appropriation persists as settler markets extract indigenous designs without consent, profiting from indigenous labor while silencing indigenous voices. Economic barriers prevent many beadworkers from sustaining themselves as mass-produced imitations flood the market and devalue traditional craftsmanship. However, as indigenous nations have always done, they adapt. Digital platforms and indigenous-run markets are allowing beadworkers to reclaim economic autonomy. Legal frameworks for indigenous intellectual property rights are being explored to safeguard cultural knowledge from settler extraction. The resurgence of beading circles ensures that knowledge, like the strawberries, is never truly lost. Beadwork is not passive. It is a radical assertion of indigenous sovereignty, resistance, and resurgence. It carries governance, history, and stories of survivance, binding past, present, and future. In continuing to bead, indigenous women assert their right to exist, to tell their own stories, and to govern themselves according to their own laws. Like the young woman offering the berries she collected after her year-long fast, beading is a commitment, one that extends beyond the self. It is a promise to care for community, to sustain knowledge, and to ensure that love, governance, and cultural survival remain woven into the future. Engaging with beadwork as governance has fundamentally reshaped my understanding of Indigenous resistance and survivance. Initially, I saw beadwork as cultural expression, but I now recognize it as a legal, diplomatic, and political practice. Like wampum belt, beadwork is a system of record-keeping, storytelling, and governance, each bead holding meaning, like sowing seeds of knowledge into each pattern. This research also exposed how colonial policies deliberately targeted beadwork to sever Indigenous women's authority. While I was aware of the Indian Act and residential schools, I had not fully grasped how these policies disrupted matrilineal governance through the suppression of beadwork itself. Realizing that beadwork functioned as a system of law and continues as a form of resistance deepened my appreciation for its enduring power. Perhaps most profound was understanding that beading is not just resistance, it's resurgence. In beading these strawberries, I found myself reflecting on their teachings in both Mohawk and Ojibwe traditions. The Haudenosaunee teach the idea that love is an act of commitment, and that the strawberry is not only a woman's medicine, but a teacher of balance, responsibility, and care. I thought about how the women who continued to bead in secret during the height of colonial violence were practicing this, showing love through the act of keeping traditions alive, ensuring knowledge was passed down despite attempts at erasure. The Ojibwe teaching of the strawberry, or Odeyemin, which translates to heartberry, as a rite of passage, also reframed my understanding of beading as a process of transformation. Just as the young woman fasting from strawberries learns from her grandmothers before collecting and offering hers to her community, beading, whether as an allied beginner like myself or as someone reclaiming and relearning lost traditions, demands patience, learning, and eventual reciprocity. It is not just about creating, but about being in relation, about carrying forward teachings that sustain others. Through this lens, beadwork is not only a means of reclaiming identity, it is a promise, a commitment to care for community, to sustain knowledge, and to ensure that love, governance, and cultural survival remain woven into the future. As a settler and ally, I am privileged to engage in this research, receive teachings, and participate in the practice of Indigenous beading. In beading these two strawberries for the project, I was intentional. If not at a table with the women in my community, then alone, listening to an article, academic paper, or documentary to ground myself in the knowledge being conveyed to me. I carried these teachings with me, reflecting on the ways love is radically enacted through care, reciprocity, and community responsibility.